The day I found the first letter, the world I had learned to live in, one built of careful omissions and a mother's iron certainty, tilted on its axis. It wasn't a gradual shift. It was a single, small thing. A weathered envelope, edges softened by time, tucked behind a splintered board in the attic where the rain couldn't reach. When I pulled it free, dust rose in a slow, golden cloud, and the smell of old paper filled my mouth like a memory that wasn't mine. On the envelope, in a handwriting I had seen only in faded photographs, was my name. To Omar, when you are ready. The words were uneven, the ink a tired blue. The date in the corner, June 12, 1998, made my throat close. My mother had always said he left before I could remember. She said he had chosen the road and walked away from us. She had said it so many times, turned that single sentence into a rhythm and then a gospel. My father abandoned us. He didn't care. He left us with nothing but his shadow. I had repeated it like catechism. I had believed it with the kind of stubbornness that starts when you are 10 and continues because the alternative, uncertainty, betrayal, feels worse than a simple, solid lie. Now, in the silence of the house after her funeral, with the autumn light through the attic window making the dust look like slow-moving stars, the envelope pulsed with a question I could no longer ignore. The house smelled like my childhood. Lemon oil from the dining table, my mother's talc, and the faint undercurrent of wood smoke from winters when the heater was a miracle. Everything else was gone. The brass clock that had once chimed off-kilter, the spindleback chairs, but the attic held things we had hidden from one another, or that she had hidden from me. My hands shook as I slit the envelope with a letter opener my mother kept in a drawer full of other small reliquaries. Receipts, a rosary, a collection of keys that never fit any lock I knew. The paper unfolded with the slow dignity of a confession. Omar, the letter began. My son, my map to a place I carry and cannot return to without leaving the rest of my life in ruins. He had signed it Kamal. The name sat there like a punctuation mark I had never fully noticed in family photographs. A man with a crooked smile, a mechanic's hands, eyes that smiled the same way my mother did when she was trying not to scold me. The letter went on. Longer than I expected, patient, embarrassed, and it spoke in a voice that was not the voice of abandonment. It spoke like someone who had rehearsed his saying for years and never found the right audience. He wrote about a factory accident, about a Sunday when a mistake cost him more than his job. He wrote about a debt that bloomed and swallowed months. He wrote about the night he left, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. He had thought disappearance would blunt the damage his troubles could cause to us. He thought his absence might be a shield. For months I wrote, he had scrawled in jagged lines, because I could not keep from trying. I was ashamed of how I left. Ashamed of the running I did when the men came for my wages. I thought if I came back, they would find you. I thought my quitting would make everything worse. The letter smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and winter, of the kinds of things that make a place in your mouth. Coal dust and boiled meat, the smell of a life built on other people's labor. There was an apology threaded through every paragraph, but it wasn't the simple apology of the man who had run. It was detailed and careful, full of the particulars that betrayal never contains. A description of the small porch light his neighbor kept on for him during one storm, the name of the woman who had given him a job rolling cigarettes in a town 2 provinces away. I read the letter in the raw hush of a house that felt both mine and a little foreign. My mother's voice echoed down the staircase, where she no longer was to shout or laugh, and I imagined her younger self, a woman with knuckles knotted by work, slamming that same piece of paper into a drawer or a fireplace and turning away. Maybe she had burned some. Maybe she had kept others. Maybe she had been a woman who did what she thought was best in the gray in-between. After the funeral, everyone had asked me the same polite, half-curious questions. How are you? Do you want to keep the house? Are you sure you can manage? My cousins had said nothing. The neighbor who used to bring my mother tea came by with a spice box and eyes like a hand squeezing a secret. People expected me to go through the motions. Attend probate, divide trivial items, make the calls. That morning in the attic, with Kamal's handwriting in my lap, I realized those motions were the only life I had let myself have for 28 years. There were more envelopes beneath the first, stacked neat as a soldier's uniforms. Each had a date, June 12th every year. Same date, as if he had circled it on a calendar, as if he had waited for a day to mark the grief and the hope in one sweep. Some were brittle. Some carried a little weight, small found objects folded into the pages. A dried child's drawing, a pressed leaf, a coin from a place I had never been. The letters continued year after year, like a metronome of effort. I sat cross-legged on the attic floor and read until the light changed and the temperature dipped and the ache under my ribs became a physical thing. They were not all apologies. Some were updates, menial and kind. I found steady hours at the mill, one read. I send a little money to your mother's cousin in Lahore. Tell her I try. Others were please. Forgive me, please forgive me. Others were strange and brave. I married once after you for a while, because I thought having a roof would look better in the letters I sent. It did not make me less lonely. The handwriting changed subtly, as if his hands had learned different pressures, or the ink had to be coaxed out of a tired pen. There was a photograph folded into the fourth letter. He had tucked it badly, the edges soft from being handled. It was him on a bus, with the world streaming past the window and a child on his lap. A small boy with my cheekbone and my mother's stubborn jaw. The boy's hair stuck up like a bird's. They both looked tired and oddly at peace, like two people who had decided to trust an in-between. My head spun. For years I had built my identity around the hole he left. I practiced resentment like muscle. I had learned to tell my own story with the same single line my mother had taught me. He left us. The thing in my lap contradicted everything I knew. It wasn't only proof that he had tried. It suggested something more complicated. He had been a man who tried and failed and tried again, who sent letters because it was all he could do. I remember the first time I'd seen my father's face properly. There had been a photograph on the mantel that my mother would not let me touch. Him younger, arms slung around her waist, a cigarette hanging from the corner of his mouth like an almost defiant punctuation. She would look at it and say nothing. When I pressed for stories, she told me that he had wanted a different life, that he had chosen wandering. She told me to stop asking. In the kitchen, while she boiled eggs and cursed the stove, she said, "He ran. That is why you have to be steady. Men who run don't come back." Her voice had the hard edge of a promise. One of the letters made me angry like a slap. "Why didn't you call?" My mother had asked him in that way of hers, sharp and small like a blade. In his reply, which was stored under the false bottom of a biscuit tin, he wrote with a humility that made me ache. "I tried to call, but the phone lines were watched. Do you remember the man who used to come and ask for my wages? He was not satisfied by taking the money. He wanted a message delivered. If they had found us, Amna, they would have followed." That paragraph matched a memory I had never told anyone. Once, when I was 7, a stranger had come to our house and my mother had argued with him through the kitchen door as though she were defending a sacred rule. I had hid in the hallway and listened to muffled names and the slap of a hand on the doorframe. My mother's anger then had been a different animal, feverish and frightened, not doctrinaire. She had slammed the door and cried for hours, the kind of crying that left a person raw. Why had she told me the simple version, the clean version? Why had she made his absence into a moral failing and not a complicated, dangerous sacrifice? That question kept me awake through the night when I finally climbed down from the attic and sat on the back steps with a string of lamps blinking in the dusk. Maybe it was easier, she had decided. Or maybe she had been protecting me from the complexity of having to choose between two equally shattering truths. They had been betrayed, or they had been endangered. Or maybe she wanted to be both protector and judge and narrative writer. People do that. Turn their pain into doctrine because uncertainty is heavier than anger. There was also a darker possibility, a thought I didn't want to nourish but couldn't banish. What if she hid the letters because she didn't want us to be found? What if the men he feared had been watching, and she thought burying the letters would bury the threat? The attic showed me things in fragments. There were other objects. A child's broken toy car, a dried baby sock with a hole the size of a small moon. There were receipts from clinics, lists of names in my mother's cramped script. The house was a palimpsest of decisions and regrets, layered and scraped raw. The next morning, I took the letters down to the kitchen table and spread them like evidence. Sunlight cut the table in half. Outside, the magnolia threw its long leaves at the gutter. I made tea because habit required a ritual. Tea for thinking, tea for mourning, tea for keeping my hands busy. The kettle sang and the house was awake in the way of houses that have been long inhabited. It remembered the sound of my mother's keys and the exact timbre of her footsteps. I wanted to know everything. I wanted to ask the dead how they had lived. That is a terrible thing to want, like yelling at a painting in the dark and expecting an answer. But the letters were a voice, and the voice had its history. The timeline that formed from the letters was ragged but coherent. He had left in '96, after threats at the steel mill, after a debt that had nothing to do with gambling yet took the same devouring shape. He had tried to find work across the province. He had been jailed once, briefly, for a fight that wasn't his but that the police took as easy currency. He wrote about a surgeon who told him he had a hernia and couldn't lift for a month, and how a neighbor named Yusuf had taken him in until he could stand again. He wrote about a small job mending chairs and the way even that made his hands feel useful. He had also written about my mother in a way that was not worshipful. He wrote about their silences, how, after he'd left, there were long stretches where she would not answer letters, how she had redecorated the house in ways that made him think she was burning the past with color. He admitted to not understanding her anger sometimes. He confessed to the kind of foolish pride that men use to build walls between themselves and others. But he never stopped trying. Each June 12th there was an envelope, each one full of small triumphs and defeat, of little amounts of money tucked in that sometimes vanished into an account I later discovered my mother had used for groceries. Some letters were returned to sender. Some he addressed to Amna, if it is not too late. Sometimes he wrote to me directly, as if I could be his judge. He called me Omar in the letters, the name he used whenever the anger was off. He wrote about the day he read that I was enrolled in the local high school, how proud he was of how I could carry myself like a man. He wrote about the time he had found my report card in a back alley and wept at the A in mathematics even though he couldn't add beyond the simplest sums. I traced the curve of his J with my finger and felt a hot and unfamiliar tenderness. If these letters were true, then everything I had been taught, about who to hate, who to excuse, needed rewriting. For 28 years, I had stored my father's abandonment in the place where heat was supposed to live. I used it as a fuel for resentments and career ambitions. Kept me moving, kept me safe. If he had not abandoned us, then my identity was built on sand. Or perhaps better, my identity had been a raft that I thought floated by design, when in truth someone had been trying to shore it up from underwater. There was one letter that made me cry without purpose. It wasn't the longest or the most apologetic. It was the 12-year letter. I wrote to you on the 12th, he had penned. And I will keep writing because writing is the only way I breathe sometimes. I work now at a place that makes doors. I name each one after a day I wish to open. I send you this leaf from the courtyard where the jacarandas bloom. I keep this letter folded into my coat, and when the rain comes I move it so it will not get wet. The movement of his small rituals, the way he named doors, the leaf, made him human to a degree that hurt. It made me realize how much I had been missing not the man, but the presence of a man who tried to be present in small, repetitive ways. There is a difference between leaving because you want to and leaving because the world pushed you out of a narrow window. The letters suggested the latter. They did not absolve him of everything. They complicated my anger with a new ingredient: grief for a man I had been allowed to hate. I wanted to question my mother. In the kitchen, next to the kettle and a plate of biscuits, lay a note she had left in her tidy handwriting. Omar, the lawyer, will call. Please see to the house. Love, A. It was small and impossible to interrogate. She was gone. There were no arguments left to have except the ones that could be held with the dead, open-ended and unfair. I thought about the way she had raised me, single-handed, with a discipline that was less maternal than managerial. She had been accomplished in the task of keeping the family upright. She had lashed me to rules like life preservers. Learn to cook. Don't trust men. Keep your temper like a tool. Do not ask stupid questions. She had cut himself out of the narrative of victimhood and placed my father there as a cautionary tale. In some ways, I'd been grateful. The certainty she offered was easier than the murky territory of mixed motives. When I pressed her about my father as a teenager, she would pause and look at me as if I had asked an impossible calculus problem. "He left because he wanted to," she would say finally. "We have to be practical. You can't be waiting for ghosts." And I had not waited. I had built a life that kept waiting from happening. A steady job at an office that smelled of toner and cheap coffee, friends who liked football and curry, a rented apartment with nights full of podcasts. I had avoided relationships because the memory of a man leaving had translated into fear of being the one abandoned. It was easier to be the one who threw things away first. The letters became a map with missing places. Each one opened a window into a life that had been parallel to ours. He had not only sent words, sometimes he had left parcels. Once there was an envelope with a single puzzle piece. He explained, "I found something in the market and it made me remember the small games you loved. I could not afford the box, but here is a piece. Keep it for me." Another time, a child's scribble in a hand that was not mine but could have been made by an aunt's neighbor's son. He had included it, embarrassed to send a drawing his hands had not made. The letters were both a bomb and an accusation. They accused the world of inequality that forces men into choices that are as cruel as they are inevitable. They accused my mother of making a narrative that protected her by isolating blame. They accused me of being a man who had accepted a single story and let it harden into something immovable. I began to understand how my mother's telling had been a kind of armor. To say he abandoned us was to make the enemy singular and external. To accept the truth, that the story had threads that wove through fear, courage, cowardice, love, and pride, was to open the wound and risk infection. I called my cousin Farah because each complex thing feels safer when shared. She arrived in her old Corolla with a thermos and a bag of samosas. She was the same size as she had been in school and wore the same pragmatic look that said she had learned not to be surprised. "You look like a man who has seen ghosts," she said, lifting an eyebrow when she saw the letters spread on the table. "I found them," I said. "All these. He wrote every year." She sat down carefully, as if letters might be fragile in a different way than paper. Why would she hide them? I told her everything I could manage. The photograph, the leaves, the way he mentioned doors. She listened like someone cataloging pieces for a puzzle. "Maybe she thought he was dangerous," she offered. "Maybe she wanted to believe in a clean story so she could survive the small-town gossip. Or maybe she could not forgive him and kept the letters because she wanted to keep her power." "Power," I repeated. "Yes, there are different kinds," she said. "One is the power to say the truth. Another is the power to make the truth simpler." She chose the second. "Maybe she thought it protected you." Her words landed like stones I had been trying, quite literally, to avoid finding underfoot. The letters also contained a detail that snapped my curiosity into something more disciplined. An address, scrawled in one margin, of a small town on the edge of a river. A place I'd never heard of. It was not typed. It was a line in a letter that seemed casual. "If anyone ever asks, I will be at 21 Mallock Lane, near the old mill." The phrase, "if anyone ever asks," felt like a test. Why would he include it if he didn't want to be found? Or did he write it hoping against hope someone would one day ask? The idea that he had left a breadcrumb that could be followed made me feel both terrified and dangerously excited. 30 years of certainty had given me a backbone. This new possibility made me feel like a child again, curious and foolish and alive. There were practicalities, of course. I was 28 with a job and a pattern of life that had never needed to connect to the man in those photographs. I had responsibilities now. Tidy the house, read legal papers, talk to the lawyer. But the letters had thrown a weight into the balance that felt like destiny. Or ruin. Or both. I made a plan that felt like a rebellion. I would not act rashly. I would not go tearing off on a bus into some unknown town without thought. I told myself I would gather proof, read every letter, trace dates, look for correspondences. I would reconstruct the part of his life I had never been allowed to see. Practical steps comforted me. They were the work of someone learning to navigate a map rather than running from a storm. The attic surrendered secrets in small fits. Under a loose floorboard, I found a tin box wrapped in a faded sari fabric with the initials AK sewn in the corner. My mother's initials married to his. Inside were newspapers clipped to articles that my mother had kept, each one a story about strikes at the mill or a police raid. There were also receipts for money orders, amounts that matched entries in his letters. He had been sending money, sometimes through complicated networks, always with a note that it was for groceries or schoolbooks. My chest tightened at the small arithmetic of love. The attic was a repository of an argument I hadn't known was happening all my life. Its artifacts were a conversation between two people who had shared decades and then chosen different languages for their separation. Reading the letters felt like eavesdropping on a marriage's private dialect. Apologies that were curbed, love that was cautious, pride that cut off its own foot to stop itself from walking back to hurt. On the third night of reading, long after the house had gone quiet and the stars had a particular sharpness that made the back garden look like a negative of the day, I found a letter that had been addressed to me but never sent. It was folded differently, tucked into the back of a hymn book. On the outside someone had written in a shaky hand, "Do not open until you are 28. My name was on the front. The years in the corner matched my birthday. My hands felt too large to open it. It was as if someone had set a time release on memory. I sat at the kitchen table and made no effort to be decisive. I held the letter like a foreign animal. When I finally slid the paper out, the handwriting trembled, and the first line was not a plea but a story. I am writing this for the man you become, not for the child who will refuse to know me. If you are angry, if you hate me, then keep this page safe for your anger. But if you must know the truth, read on. I will not ask for forgiveness. I will only ask to be remembered as I was." He wrote about a night when the mill had burned and about a man named Riaz who had promised help and then asked for a favor too large to give. He wrote about the moment he decided that staying would mean putting me and your mother at risk. When the men came for me, they wanted not only my wages but leverage. They asked about you. I could not let them have that. So I left letters instead. I left money where I could. I left because I hoped that distance would make me less dangerous. He signed it, Kamal, with the little flourish he'd always used. For a long time I read nothing after the signature. I let the weight of a man who had carried a possibility of danger like a resource settle into me. He had thought he protected us by leaving. My mother had thought she protected us by erasing him. Both had been fighting with an image of danger that had been real and persistent. Outside the house, late-night traffic hummed like a distant ocean. I drank the last of the tea cooling at the bottom of the mug. The letters were a country, and I had only walked into its border. Part of me wanted to knock on every door in the village our family had left behind and demand answers. Part of me wanted to close the letters and throw them into the incinerator and return to an ordered life that valued efficiency over truth. The problem with truth is that, once smuggled out into daylight, it cannot easily be folded back into the dark. The envelope with my name on it had already done its work. It had made my history a negotiable thing. I slept badly that night, and the dream I had involved trains and a river and a small child reaching for a man's hand and being ignored. In the morning, the letters were waiting like a jury. I had made a choice without admitting it, to follow these breadcrumbs as far as they would go. There was a plan in my bones now. I would reconstruct the timeline, compare the letters to public records, see whether the addresses and names meant anything. I would call the neighbor who used to bring my mother tea and ask the questions that felt like trespass. Did he ever come by? Did you see him? Did you know? I would track down Yusuf, if Yusuf still lived, and ask him if Kamal had ever mentioned an old friend who kept doors. All of this sounded like the work of someone looking through a window at a life. But the letters had made something obvious. Truth, like a locked chest, requires the keys you were denied. If there was a chance my father had been trying, then the only way to honor both my mother's sacrifice and his attempts was to understand why she had chosen the story she told me. So I set a small rule for myself: no anger yet. Read the letters. Make notes. Do not rush to judgment. There was pragmatism in that. There was fear, too. If I let the letters move me too quickly, I risked doing something I could not undo. If I delayed, I risked letting the moment slip into a slow numbness that would look like contentment. I was a man who survived on small plans. I wrote a list. Catalog every letter. Photograph each one. Find the dates and names. Call Farah for backup if I needed someone to drive me to the place the letters pointed to. The list was the first honest thing I had made in a long time that was not work-related. It contained a seed of something dangerous. Hope. There was risk in hope, of course. Hope is a thin rope swung over a river of what-ifs. But I had been taught to live carefully, and perhaps the most careful thing now was to hold my father's words as evidence and not as absolution. The letters were proof that someone outside the house had not stopped trying. They also implied other things. He might be dead or alive in pain. He might have remarried. He might not want to be found. The discovery of the letters did not give me an ending. It gave me a quest. I walked through the rooms of the house and imagined how my mother must have kept the letters hidden. I could see her, a woman who had never let herself crumble openly, folding an envelope into a sari, or into the back of a Bible or behind a board. She had kept them because she wanted to control the narrative, or because she feared for our safety, or because she wanted to decide when the truth could be told, if ever. The kitchen was quiet. The letters lay like small islands of possibility. I had been taught to be good at one thing, follow the facts. So I would follow these facts now. I would catalog every date, every name, every reference. My father had told me in his last unsent letter that he would be at 21 Mallock Lane, near the old mill, if anyone ever asked. The address was both specific and vague, like a riddle designed to be solved by someone with patience. I had patience because I had spent my life in rooms pretending not to need someone. I could be patient now, and build my questions into an order that would protect me from rushing into a place where the consequences could be heavier than I imagined. I would ask. I would go. I would read more letters. I would fetch the photographs and the pressed leaves. I would allow the man who had written them to be more than the ghost my mother had taught me to hate. And when I was ready, I would ask the old question we all avoid. Why did you write every year? I started with the dates. Grief had left the house hollow, but routine gave the emptiness walls again. Each morning, I sat at the dining table with the letters stacked chronologically, a notebook open, my mother's old reading glasses perched on my nose because somewhere along the line my own eyes had begun to blur at the edges. Outside, the neighborhood moved in its predictable rhythms. Vendors calling, scooters coughing to life, children dragging backpacks too big for their shoulders. Inside, time moved backward. June 12th. Every year. Sometimes the ink bled like he'd written in rain. Some years the handwriting leaned hard to the right, urgent, hopeful. Other years it sagged, as if gravity had more authority over his hand. I built a timeline. 1996. Left home. Threats at the mill. Debt connected to missing inventory after a fire. 1997. Temporary work near a rail yard. First mention of men asking questions. 1998. First direct letter to me. I would have been 2. 2001. Short jail stay after a fight. No charges stuck. 2003. Working with Yusuf repairing chairs and doors. First mention of the town near the river. 2008. Hernia surgery. Recovery at Yusuf's sister's house. 2010 onward. Increasing references to the mill town, the old bridge, Mallock Lane. It wasn't perfect, but it was a life. A hard, ordinary, stubborn life. I called the neighbor, Auntie Salma, who had known my mother since before I was born. Her voice crackled through the phone like paper near flame. You found them, she said, before I could explain. I swallowed. You knew. A long pause. I knew letters came. I didn't know what was inside. Your mother, she asked me once if I thought a child could grow strong with a father who was only sometimes there. I said I didn't know. She said she would rather you grow with one clean wound than many small ones. The words lodged in my chest. Did he ever come here? I asked. Once, she said quietly. Years ago. At night. He stood across the street. Didn't knock. Your mother saw him from the window. She didn't move. Neither did he. After a while he left. What year? I don't remember. You were maybe 12? 13. That would have been the year of the jacaranda leaf. I thanked her and hung up, my hands cold. He had come back. Close enough to see the house. Close enough to see the light in the window. And he had left again. That image stayed with me all day. A man standing under a flickering street lamp, looking at a home he believed he could not enter. 3 days later, I took leave from work. I told my manager it was for family matters, which was both true and insufficient. I packed a small bag, slid the most important letters into a waterproof folder, and wrote the address from the margin onto a piece of paper I folded into my wallet. 21 Malik Lane, near the old mill, riverside town called Badrin. The bus ride took 6 hours. The city dissolved into flat fields, then into scrubland, then into low industrial sprawl that looked like it had been built reluctantly and abandoned halfway through the idea. The river appeared suddenly, wide and dull silver under a clouded sky. Badrin was smaller than I expected. A market street with faded awnings. A chuteira de cinema. 2 tea stalls facing each other like rival philosophers. And beyond it all, the skeleton of an old mill. Brick chimney cracked, windows punched out like missing teeth. I stepped off the bus with the folder of letters pressed against my ribs like a second heartbeat. The air smelled of rust and wet soil. Malik Lane turned out to be less of a lane and more of a long, uneven strip of houses stitched together from brick, tin, and stubbornness. Laundry hung between poles. A dog slept in the middle of the road like it owned the future. Number 21 had a green door with peeling paint. I stood there longer than I should have. What was I expecting? A reunion? Agrave? A stranger who had never heard my name? I knocked. Nothing. I knocked again, louder. Footsteps shuffled inside. The door opened a cautious inch, held by a chain. One eye studied me through the gap. Yes. The voice was old but not frail. I'm looking for Kamal, I said. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. The chain slid back. The door opened. The man in front of me was thinner than in the photographs, beard fully white, shoulders curved inward like parentheses. But the eyes, they were mine, or maybe mine were his. For a moment neither of us spoke. The world narrowed to breath and recognition. Omar, he whispered, like he was afraid saying it too loud would break it. My throat closed. I nodded. His hand flew to his mouth. He took one unsteady step back and caught himself on the wall. I moved forward instinctively, and then we were standing an arm's length apart, both unsure of the distance we were allowed to cross. You got the letters, he said. I did. He nodded, once, like a man confirming the sky was still above him. Come in, he said. His house was small, but clean in the way of someone who has learned to respect the few things he owns. A fan turned lazily overhead. On one wall hung a calendar from a hardware store 3 years out of date. And there, above a narrow desk, was something that stopped me cold. A corkboard covered in photographs. Me. School photo from 5th grade. A blurry picture from a sports day event. A snapshot of me outside the college gates. Where did you get these? I asked, my voice barely air. He smiled shyly. People talk. I asked. Sometimes I paid. You followed my life? From far, he said quickly. Only to know you were safe. I never came close again after that night your mother saw me. I understood. Anger flared, sudden and hot. Understood what? That we didn't need you. He winced but didn't look away. That my presence would only bring trouble. The men I owed. They didn't forget easily. I stayed away until they forgot me. By then, he gestured helplessly. Years had passed. You could have tried harder. I know, he said. No defense. No argument. Just agreement. That disarmed me more than denial would have. We sat at the small table. He made tea with hands that shook only a little. I noticed a scar running from his wrist to his thumb, surgical. Hernia? I asked. He blinked in surprise. You read that one. I read all of them. He nodded slowly, absorbing the fact that his words had finally landed somewhere. She never wrote back, he said after a while. Not after the first few years. I didn't know they existed. I thought so, he said softly. Silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was thick with all the versions of this conversation that had never happened. Why June 12th? I asked. He smiled, small and private. That's the day you first laughed. Really laughed. You were 6 months old. Your mother dropped a spoon and you laughed like the world had told you a joke. I pressed my lips together hard. He remembered that. We talked until the light shifted gold. He told me about Yusuf, who had died 5 years ago. About the mill closing. About working odd repair jobs, fixing doors, window frames, anything that could be made useful again. I like doors, he said. They are promises. I told him about my job, my apartment, my mother's illness at the end. He lowered his head. I wanted to come, he said. But I didn't know if I had the right. I didn't know either. But I didn't tell him that. When evening came, he insisted I take the bed. He slept on a mat on the floor like it was nothing. I lay awake listening to his breathing in the dark, the reality of him rearranging the architecture of my past. This was not a ghost. This was a man who had aged in parallel with my anger. The next morning, we walked by the river. He moved slowly, but with purpose. People greeted him, called him Kamal Bai. He had built a life here, small but rooted. Did you ever remarry? I asked. Briefly, he said. She wanted children. I was already full of someone else. I didn't know where to put that sentence, so I let it sit between us like something fragile. We reached the old bridge. Rusted railings. Water moving steady beneath. I used to stand here on June 12th, he said, and imagine you growing taller somewhere I couldn't see. I looked at him, really looked. The lines around his eyes. The permanent stoop of someone who had carried more than furniture. You should have fought harder to come back, I said, not accusing now, just stating a truth that belonged to both of us. Yes, he said. I was afraid and ashamed. Those two things make cowards of many men. It was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to me about fatherhood. We stood there a long time, not healed, but no longer strangers. The days that followed felt like stepping into a life I had only glimpsed through glass. I stayed at his house, moved cautiously between curiosity and caution, each action weighted by years of absence and letters that had carried more hope than any human being should have had to carry alone. We cooked together in silence, or with small talk, about the weather, the stubborn river, the neighbors. He called me Omar without hesitation. I stopped flinching at the sound. One evening, while sorting through some more letters, I found a stack that had never been sent. They were unfinished, jagged-edged scraps he had scribbled on when he thought no one would ever read them. There was one dated the year I turned 10. I wanted to walk through the park with you today. I didn't because I knew it would hurt more than help. Perhaps tomorrow, in another life. I realized then how much he had sacrificed, how carefully he had measured each step away from us so that our lives could continue undisturbed, even if that meant erasing himself from every memory. I felt both fury and awe. He had left, yes, but not because he didn't care. He had left because caring sometimes meant stepping back when the world demanded sacrifice. Over the next week, we shared stories I had never heard. His childhood in a small town, his first job at a metalworks factory, the friends who had become family and then faded into memory. He laughed at my awkward teenage antics, apologized for not being there for my first bicycle ride, my first school play, and I listened, sometimes asking questions, sometimes just nodding, letting the sound of his voice fill spaces that had long been hollow. He wanted to know about my mother. I told him everything I could, her strength, her stubbornness, the way she had tried to make a world where we would survive despite him leaving. He listened, a quiet sorrow in his eyes, understanding both the pain she had carried and the choices she had made. One afternoon, he pulled out a small box from under the bed. Inside were objects he had kept through the years. A tiny wooden toy car, a pressed leaf from a tree near our old house, a photograph of me in my first school uniform. He handed them to me gently. I kept these, he said, because even though I couldn't be there, I wanted to be close in some small way. I held the toy car and felt tears sting my eyes. All the years of imagining him as absent, uncaring, indifferent, They collapsed in an instant. He had never stopped trying. The proof was here, tangible, persistent. We went back to the river the next morning. He showed me the old mill where he had worked after leaving us, the tiny repair shops he had opened, the homes he had built for neighbors who had nowhere else to go. He had created a life of quiet good deeds, small kindnesses, and steady work. I realized then that the man before me wasn't just my father. He was a person who had survived unimaginable pressure, danger, and guilt, yet had continued to act with thoughtfulness wherever he could. I began sharing more of my life with him, my job, my apartment, my friends. And as the days passed, a strange thing happened. I felt the layers of resentment and fear, long held and meticulously maintained, start to unravel. They didn't vanish instantly. Resentment has roots deep in the soil of memory, but they softened, loosened by understanding and presence. One evening, as we sat on the porch, he said something that made me pause. "I didn't know if you'd ever want to meet me. I feared rejection more than the men who chased me. I'm here," I said. "That's all that matters." And in that simple exchange, I realized that reconciliation wasn't about undoing the past. It was about making space for the future. We spent the following days repairing things together. The leaky roof, the garden fence, even some old doors he had promised to fix for neighbors. With each small repair, our trust grew. The awkwardness of years apart gave way to a rhythm of shared effort. And slowly, I allowed myself to hope, not just for understanding, but for connection. The final letter I read was dated just last year. He had written about the fear of being forgotten, of being replaced, of never knowing if I had ever truly felt his presence. But he had also written about hope, about believing that one day we might meet, and that all the distance, all the silence, might be bridged. And now we were bridging it. On my last night in Badrin, we sat by the river. He handed me a folded piece of paper, a map of Malik Lane with small notes, where I waited, where I thought of you, where I almost returned. I held it like a treasure. "I don't want to leave," I said quietly. "You will always have a place here," he replied. "And if you want, you can return anytime. Not as a visitor, but as a son." I realized then that I had found something more valuable than letters or photographs or maps. I had found truth, the kind that doesn't erase pain but gives it context, the kind that shows you who people really are beneath the narratives they, or others, have constructed, the kind that allows forgiveness not as an obligation but as a gift to yourself. The morning I left Badrin, he walked me to the bus. I paused at the edge of the street and turned to look at him. He stood there, smaller now in the bright sun, yet somehow larger than any memory I had ever carried of him. "Take care of yourself," he said. "I will," I said, and for the first time in decades I believed it. The bus pulled away slowly, and I pressed the letters and photographs to my chest. I knew our story wasn't over. It would never be. But it had begun again, not with blame, not with absence, but with presence, with understanding, with the quiet rebuilding of trust. I realized then that life doesn't always give you neat endings. Sometimes it gives you the chance to rewrite them, to reach across years and silence and fear, and discover that people are often more complicated and more loving than the stories we tell ourselves. When I returned home, I cataloged every letter, every photograph, every memory, preserving them not as proof of abandonment, but as testament to effort, persistence, and the invisible threads that bind us. And in doing so, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. If you enjoyed the story and want to discover more tales of hidden truths, family, and emotional journeys, subscribe now for more stories that will touch your heart and keep you captivated.